Simply stated today, celebrating the first day of spring here in northern Michigan, which today I could show you outside if I had time, but it's literally covered in snow. I've got half my makeup done, or two-thirds of my makeup done, so I'm going to finish doing it for you for the show. I'm just showing you a new technique here with some like gold here over here, and I'm going to show you how to finish the rest of that off today. I noted up here in Traverse City there was a lot of celebrations for St. Patrick's Day last weekend. And I know for a lot of people they still celebrate on Monday, but I even saw people still doing celebrations yesterday. So I decided to keep going with the whole St. Patrick's Day sort of let's do spring sort of mash it together type episode today, which will probably have more than a few of, we'll just incorporate it all together like this, take the Easter egg, and yeah. I got a little cheapy one at the dollar store to give you this point. And so for the makeup, let's do that first and we'll get into some more serious topics. We'll be talking about just a review of what the show is actually about, simply stated, because it's probably my most important show and also like my sometimes least viewed unless I'm in a two-piece, right? So, such is life. And here I've gone ahead and I've done my foundation, my blush, and some lipstick. Haven't finished the lipstick, and I've done my eyebrows mostly and put a gold powder on. And what that does is sort of change the planes of your face a little bit and give you a different look if you want to go for something more ethereal. One way to blend that in is I've got this blending brush here, so you go like that with it. And then, so that then becomes underneath, so I've got like a couple layers going if you want to get that sort of dewy look, especially if you're going out. I know some of you have events coming up in the spring, or maybe you just want to do something kind of fun, and then layer on some more. This is like it's called Conceal Megalow. So you kind of put that up over this, and then like that. Yeah, I literally saw a couple last night with like orange and green lights in their kitchen. They were like making a stew and having people over, so like it's just so going up here. So I don't know where you are in the world, but I think March in general for a lot of people, maybe you don't necessarily have time to celebrate the holiday over the previous weekend or even on the day of. You're gonna do it whenever, or maybe you're just somebody that wants to, somehow extend holidays for yourself. Ooh, and then this one's gonna put an ad in, and we don't want to hear that. Yeah. No ads in the show. So, yeah. Love you, YouTube, but you have a bad habit of doing that. Oh, hi, Neha. How are you? Oh, you're from India? Thank you. Thank you for joining in today. We're doing a little talk show. People here in the U.S. are still celebrating St. Patrick's Day, so it's very nice to see you watching online. Hope you were having a good day. Yeah, I do. I will take some time to greet people before we get into topics here. Thank you. I'm doing well. Hi, Ramen. How are you? Yes. So I'm finishing up my mascara here with a really nice $5 mascara because I have like no budget for makeup, but I get some really good stuff. I spent all those years doing development for companies to get cheaper cosmetics out there in the marketplace for the rest of us. So I have some really good stuff that doesn't cost too much, but I can't afford the more expensive stuff, And then let's do some, we'll do a little white. Ramen, Neha says, beautiful makeup, and Ramen says, I'm fine, thanks. Okay. And then we'll just blend this in a little bit more. So I remember I talked about, like back in the thought project, you should do a little white up here in the brow bone underneath the eyebrow to delineate it more. So now I've got this really fun, like sort of dewy look going. And that's how you do that. You actually take the gold sparkle, before you do your mascara, put it on over your eyebrow makeup and everything else, all around the eye area, and then you like blend it in. And then you use the heavy concealer to Slayer Develops says they're going to put donations on here. Yeah, I should get a tip jar going, huh? I got up this morning and I thought about how successful the live show was at Christmas and how much people enjoyed that. I thought, well, I mean, St. Patrick's Day is kind of a mini holiday, but it is one that's generally celebrated around the world. Maybe it's time to do another sort of live show and talk with people a little bit today. And my makeup is now done. I think I could put a little bit of, I mean, I could do my gloss, I guess, here. Yeah, I do need to look at monetization on this. I have a fair number of subscribers, and if I'm going to keep doing YouTube and put more time into it, I need to make more money off of it. I do have an OnlyFans account, which does make me some money to support my work. But, as an independent journalist, it would be nice to find a way to put some kind of tip jar on this as well. That would be good for me and maybe make everyone else happy too. Maybe after them quit. I just finished a government contracting job that went for about 3 months and I was very successful at it. But, and I'm like everybody else who finished a contracting job, to go find another one. To stay employed and happy, and I don't have, so I can't just spend all my time making shows for you all, because OnlyFans doesn't make enough that I could just do this all the time. It's basically, my social media and my nonprofit work with modeling is all literally a form of, the nonprofit projects that I participate in is literally a type of donation, charity work that I do. And then this obviously has some monetization over for OnlyFans. So if you're wondering how people make a living at it, most of them really don't. It's just something people do as sort of a labor of love until they get to a certain level with it. And that's actually a lot of the entertainment industry. And so to remind you, the show itself is about what I went through as a victim of labor trafficking. I'm 44, by the way. And yeah, Ron wants to know how old I am. I'm 44. I'm a 44-year-old woman, and this is episode 19, by the way. And it's to remind you that the show is about labor trafficking, the use of radio signals for crime, and just going back, talk about all the weird incidents that happened in Dubuque, Iowa. I talked about the history of industrialization and crime and how that's affected the world, and how I just delineated a number of different terrorist groups. So to a certain extent, I'm doing some counterterrorism work and analysis, and then and then we talk about pop stuff, because I was trafficked for the entertainment industry in the U.S. and have never been paid or compensated for it. And on that note, I need to remind everyone, I see the changes that the Trump administration is trying to make and other administrations have tried to make, and it's really important to remember that this is all going to look like lip service for the rest of us unless we actually get some financial compensation for everything that's happened to us. Because I'm not the only person who's a victim of labor trafficking. I'm probably one of the most successful survivors of what happened that I've known of. But it was just, yeah. And we'll talk more about some of the cuts the U.S. government, what's gone on federally here in the U.S. as well. I look like I'm 30, 32. Yes, I do. I look like a 30 to 32-year-old. Yep. I put a lot of time and effort in my skin and taking care of myself and my regimen. And I drink a lot of water. And yeah, I do a lot of resilience work. I want to talk today. I'm going to start out. This show's going to be an interesting one. We're going to go into, first of all, I need to talk about a person who passed at U.V.A. where I attended. Well, the faculty, we're going to discuss history with Salma Hayek. We're going to talk about recent events with Kanye. We're going to talk about some conceptual stuff with abuse, and we're going to talk about some Russian FSB couples that need to be outed, and yeah, we're going to go from there. But I want to go with the first thing, which is that John T. Casteen, who is the former president of the University of Virginia, passed away on Tuesday this week. He was one of the longest running presidents, other than the original president, and he died on Tuesday of pancreatic cancer. He suffered only briefly with it. He was born December 11th, 1943. He had a wife and kids that have survived him, and longest reigning president, 20 years, older white man. And he was known for being someone who graduated a prolific number of women and minorities, expanded funding and financing for them. It's important to know that I got my certification in public relations at the school during his years. I finished my degree in 2007, did my graduation ceremony in early 2008, and then ended up, going on to live an improved life simply because of U.V.A. So I have a full professional certification from an Ivy League school for because of UVA. And so that's really important to remember about him, because I met with him and I told him about what I was going through in the extortion scheme. And he said he was extremely concerned that I would be killed. He was really worried about me being killed. And not many people ever came forward like that in the DC area. He traveled up there from UVA in Charlottesville, their headquarters in Charlottesville, at a campus in Falls Church to tell me that. And so many people were so weak on the issue, and yet he wasn't. And so when I make the show, it isn't to say, white men bad, let's go get the white men, or black men bad, or there's a group that's bad. It's to say, here's what's been going on, and here's the divide. Because the U.S. government has gone ahead and called some of the organizations that I've been detailing terrorist groups, and has begun putting together legislative work to pursue military action against them. And so I can see that there's action there from people of all kinds of different viewpoints and backgrounds to tackle the issue of labor trafficking. And it's important to know that this does stem from the Russian FSB, and John knew that. And John was an advocate for human rights and against labor trafficking. And because of him, I got that first post high school degree where I got a real education, because Luther College was a terrible school. It's a labor camp, and I didn't get a good education there at all, hardly. And I needed significant help with restructuring my thought processes and analysis. And I got that at the University of Virginia when I got my certification in public relations. I've never been so proud of my whole life as I was of that degree. The fact that my ex, who goes by the name David, it's also known as Chris Evans here in the U.S., and is not really considered to be very important except for the fact that he's really dangerous. He hated the fact that I got that certification. He hated the school for it. The fact that there were shootings there during the time I was down in Charlottesville was tied directly to the fact that Endeavor WME, which is now considered a terrorist group, was responsible for those because of their hatred of the school's choices. The fact that Georgetown was once considered an Ivy League school is no longer seen as one because of their choices to support labor trafficking is important to know and to note. So, the show isn't really political towards one side or the other. It's that I'm tackling a specific issue. Yes, I was actively a part of the the Red Old Party, the Republican Party, when I was in the DC. That was the party I chose. But I created a coalition of people in both parties and also among libertarians because the issue I was working on and still work on. So, and on that note, I want to note that when I was at the University of Virginia, they told me to try going to Nova for my sciences degree. They had hoped that I could go to nursing school there. I unfortunately wasn't able to go there or even to go to U.V.A. for a nursing degree, and had to put pursuing a nursing degree aside because of what is being called now the cartels in the U.S. and their activity even down there in Virginia. So it's sad, but that's the truth. And it's also important to note that John literally passed away the day after I put out one of my most seminal episodes, which was on Susanne Bassey, of the, she's supposed to be at the Wendy Williams show, and apparently has been some kind of extortion scheme of her own on that show, trafficking them all these years. And we'll see what happens with that. It's important to recognize all of this when you look at this context, because she's supposed to be this producer up in New York, and yet she was down in DC all the time. And then she actually had a daughter who went to UVA and completed nursing there. Yeah, Susanne Bass. Yep. And now she's like trying to put up weird pictures of other people and to cover up her behavior. It's really weird. So Susanne Bass, sorry, not Susanne Bass, Susanne Bass. She had a daughter who went to the school. The reason why I'm sort of unclear about the name is because she went by the name Diane down in Virginia. And of course, I took out a protective order against her. She attacked me. She sprained my whole back. So, John was aware of this because her estranged daughter who went through the nursing program actually went to the Charlottesville police while she was at the school and took out an order against her mom. Or that's actually a man, but Susanne Bass. So it does all circle around, believe me, and that's why I tell people to follow all the shows and to keep up with everything, because and make your own charts, because you'll get confused because what I cover is so in depth and tracks all these different groups of people, because I lived in the Washington D.C. area for 19 years. So, and on that note, God bless John's family, I don't label myself as part of a specific religious group, but I think it's important to note that he was a great man and a good man and stood in frank bas relief against the men that I knew at Luther College. Like we talked about how corrupt Torgenson was. We talked about in Higgum, who actually turned out to be a dude that was actively screaming and yelling at me that she wanted to have sex with me and prostitute me when I was at the school and, abused everyone. And, you know, it's just hard when a good man passes. A good leader and a good man passes. It's a loss for all of us. And there's a triumph there that his life was one that was really lived in majesty. And I just find it to be so strange that he died like the next day after I made that episode finally about Susan Bass. Because I know for a fact that she was a problem for the university too. And she was a problem in Arlington, and she's totally out of control, and she's totally supported by the Russian government and part of the cartels here in the U.S. and the weird cults. And, something had to change dramatically in this country. And the fact that there were so many government employees, because let's address that. Because I was, during my years in D.C., especially during the worst years of George Bush years, and then at least part of the Obama administration was just horrible, was going to government employee after government employee and discussing the issues, and they were being rejecting. And I was constantly being gaslighted by different female employees for the government, especially. Some would scream and yell at me that I was just supposed to be literally trafficked. And that did happen to me for a while because of some of the, what you call now the cartels, but it's truly people related to Russian FSB. Now they're called Hell Jalisco, Nicaragua, like those groups. But, I was pretty clearly trafficked by them for a very long time. And so that's the part of the show, is that nobody's going to be allowed to forget about the fact that some pervert from one of those groups and several men thought it was okay to beat and abuse me for a good, from 2009 through to 2015. And that I had already been through significant abuse here in the U.S. because of them, and that my mother was killed by them. And that those groups are actually tied directly to P. Diddy. He was a middleman for them with his white parties. That when I was living down in Charlottesville, I was branded at the time. People broke into my apartment a few years ago, and simply because I had a white coverlet on my bed, I was branded. And then again, I dealt with a guy who's related to them in southern Michigan, had a white coverlet on my bed, and same thing got, went through an anal rectal rape. So I'm not trying to be disgusting to you. I'm just letting you know, this stuff all kind of goes together. Obviously, my more fun shows are the ones where I get to sing or I do yoga for you or dance, right? But we still have to make Simply Stated because of all these other events that have happened and the struggle. Because if without Simply Stated, we have no Simply Yoga. We don't have any Simply Cooking with Deborah on OnlyFans or all these other shows. So this is, the harder news show and investigative reporting that I'm putting forth based on my life experience. And a lot of it is also to help and support regular everyday people, whether U.S. citizens or not. They're trying to understand these issues even transnationally, because all crime is transnational now. And what I want to get into is that, I see that there's been some cuts to the U.S. government what is this, thousands of DHS employees who were corrupt have been fired. That's really good. I'm going to go through and look for my notes here on all this stuff. Because that's where it starts. It starts with cutting USAID. It starts with firing all of these different DHS employees that were mean. It starts with the women who were hanging out at Arlington County that I told you about, that knew about the attack on Capitol Hill and wanted to set up for Russia because they wanted Russia to be able to take over the U.S. government. The fact that they were doing all this, and that they, were deliberately asking me for money, saying, well, you got divorced, and I didn't actually really have a divorce, and they were trying to demand money from me, and I was over there to get employment help. This was in 2011. And so when you talk about DOGE and what's going on, it isn't that government isn't important. It's that when H.W. Bush engaged in expansion of the CIA to include Booz Allen Hamilton, and then Booz Allen Hamilton moved forward to aggressively install people from the Russian FSB and Chinese CCP in government jobs and hack and disrupt government agencies, that becomes a massive problem for the U.S. itself. It becomes a form of anarchy. It becomes a form of budget bloat. And so when I see people on TV complaining about the government being cut, this is not about cutting the government so that perverts who want to hurt kids can have more power. This is about cutting the government so that the perverts who wanted to have power so they can hurt kids don't have as much power. because there were one too many perverts down in the federal area after federal jobs, even at U.S.A, even at DHS. And now there's been negotiations to limit the TSA. I told you about the guy from Luther College that was directly responsible for many of us being illegally flown around the country in traffic, that he worked directly with Jeffrey Epstein to traffic people. It was extremely difficult to get him fired from the TSA because the unions, that the Russian FSB has corrupted the unions in the U.S., that even though I was an actress and paid for my work, I couldn't even get to SAG, which is the Screen Actors Guild, to get proper representation for myself, that the way the Hollywood system was set up was deliberately set up and ripe for labor trafficking. DHS has said the unions were hindering the TSA's ability to safeguard our transportation system and to keep Americans safe because of the unions, which have been corrupted by the Russian FSB. It's not a complex issue, it's a very simple one. And so when you're looking at the news, I would not pay attention to anyone who wants to complain about government cuts at this point, because we're like billions, trillions of dollars in debt, and as a country, and can't afford anything. And as a citizen who's literally living paycheck to paycheck, I have no time and energy for it. I simply did too much work in my life that I didn't get paid for, and went through too much cruelty and labor trafficking to tolerate it myself. This is all things that we have to consider. Right now, the Democratic Party is considering getting rid of Chuck Schumer as their leader, just like the GOP has already made moves to have Senator Mitch McConnell retire, because Senator Mitch McConnell has a woman in his office who went to Luther College. She's an Iranian who hindered labor trafficking issues and policy in the U.S. So Mitch McConnell will not be staying in office. And now the Democratic Party is seeking to make the same kind of changes. So for most of us as like regular people, it's, you don't have to like get aside and be really hyper about it. But sometimes you might just want to sit back and watch, because this has all been in the works for a really long time. As far as the government cuts here in the U.S., the changes, the really serious changes that need to be made. Now, I need to address something else, which is that last week on March 15, 2025, Nayib Bukele of the CCOT, the Terrorism Confinement Center in El Salvador, released footage of his country taking and receiving 23 MS-13 members and 238 Trinidad members into confinement for a time of at least 1 year. And ironically, one of the guys that helped out Freddie Klein, that we had put into prison finally here in the US, Freddie Klein, well, the guys that helped him and set things up for him with the State Department and to undermine and attack the U.S. government on behalf of Russia, actually, one by the name Krzysztof Blonsky, looked exactly like one of the prisoners. So I don't know if they actually ended up arresting Krzysztof Blonsky finally, but I haven't seen him around or signs of him on social media anymore. I think they actually picked him up finally and put him in prison. And it's important to know that because he had a position at Fox News and engaged in harassment of Megyn Kelly and other people there. And it was just all Russian FSB, crap, and supportive of the cartels, and turns out to be Venezuelan. And important to recognize that Trinidad itself is Russian in origin, even if it is out of Venezuela. Same with El Jalisco. So, I'm covering the tough topics here based on bitter life experience because they killed my mom and my dad, right? And unfortunately, Buzoma Hamilton has finally been sued at the very end of this last year for the tune of $15 million for their behavioral support. I mean, they do the vishing and fishing so that somebody like Wilhelm could be let out of prison repeatedly, and he's a violent rapist and was harassing, attacking me, and stealing from me. And Cersei's out of prison all the time, and she's supposed to be in prison. And we've had to, as a country, had to begin considering contracts with other countries to have people removed because we don't have full control over Buzoma Hamilton, which is loosely basically the Russian FSB and Chinese CCP, just literally hacking our systems to let bizarre violent predators back out of prison after they commit crimes, if nothing else, to create anarchy. So I see improvements. I mean, and we have activist judges. That's the term that got turned into a euphemism. People stopped taking it seriously. They started saying, oh, the activist judges, and it gets blown off as a term. And it's like, why would you blow that off? There's clearly a judge or two now that have gotten angry and protested at the president and filed motions against him for sending some really nasty, violent criminals to a prison outside the U.S. and want them to what? You put in prisons here in the U.S. so they can just get back out? Because the guy that violently raped and trafficked me in 2019 that worked for the Russian government was clearly part of the cartels and was out in Charlottesville attacking me physically and other people. has gotten out of prison repeatedly in the U.S. He very clearly needs to be shipped to El Salvador or some other country so we can actually get our processes working. Our justice system has been handicapped by trying to keep and support some of these people here. So, it's important to know that. And it's important to note also that we're going through a phase. I want to go back to the last episode where I talked about Mariah Carey, because Mariah Carey's father's last name is Nunez, and he's from Venezuela and an engineer, an aerospace and aeronautical engineer, which is just hugely suspicious because the technology is involved in trafficking the rest of us and the use of submarines and everything here. And then noting that all of her songs seem to be pretty much completely different stylistically and semantically, and the acumen around them is simply not in her. And they sound like completely different people when you start listening. The fact that some of them are actually just insane is something else. Like, Mariah Carey has some really bad music. She's a few songs that were pretty fun, but she's turned out to be the worst, and also a has-been at this point. And paying for weird shows the same way J-Lo does. And what bothers me about the cartels is they tend to think it'll all be fine for the trafficking of the rest of us if, Mariah Carey and J-Lo just look stupid. Well, that's not going to be enough. I mean, they're playing for J-Lo, frankly, because she was actually at Luther College when I was there and trafficked myself and other people for material and can't sing or really dance. And wears like a prosthetic face, but a whole weird thing. It's important to note that she, the plan for her was for her to just be like 50, 60, 70 years old and hanging out perfectly free and just continuously singing the We Were Dumb song from On the Six about, how she slept around out of place and has chlamydia. It's really disgusting how she has chlamydia. It's like the one where she's like, I've had so many men, it seems they're all the same. My appetite for loving is not my hunger pain. And then she's like, I'm real. It's like, and your grand punishment for the murder of my mom and millions of dollars stolen and the bizarre behavioral disorder and everything else is that you are gonna be like 70 years old on stage somewhere in a bad like thong outfit and boots singing about chlamydia? Because I don't think that's really enough. And that's really my request too, as far as the U.S. government goes. Is, please do all the content you want, have all the fights you want, do all the media you want, but if I, as someone who was trapped for over 3+ years, can't get restitution and payment for the work that I've done, and you're just going to let these facetious and overly weird celebrities roll and pretend like they're just stupid when they're obviously gangsters and traffickers and terrorists, then it's just not going to be good enough. J-Lo can't stay free in the U.S. Taylor Swift can't stay free in the U.S. Beyonce cannot stay free in the U.S. And Deborah WME cannot continue to operate in the U.S. Kendrick is actually going to have to be taken on and arrested for what he did to my life, personally, individually, and others. Obviously, none of this is personal. This is how cartels operate, terrorist groups operate, how cults operate. But I just want everyone to understand that. So that's why I make the show, because something more has to happen. Notably, meanwhile, Canada is getting rid of Justin Trudeau as their leader. I need to look up who they're getting next, but we just had a $30+ billion tariff placed on our products in their country. And so I guess that's going to change costs here in the U.S. And I don't know where Justin Trudeau is planning to go, but he's clearly leaving his position as leader of Canada. And so he's resigning as of January 6th, 2025. He resigned as both the Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Party. And then as soon as the party chooses someone else, he will be officially done with his position as the leader of the party. And I don't see anything that says exactly what the timeline is here. There's like 3 different articles, because I like to try to triple source things. I don't want to get into anyone sort of perceiving me as directing their government, but it's just, there's a lot of change going on right now. And some of it's needed. I don't know that I saw Justin Trudeau as the problem, but he's clearly leaving. And Chuck Schumer is leaving as leader of the Democratic Party in the Senate here in the U.S. at the federal level. And, Mitch McConnell is leaving as the GOP leader for the Republican Party in the U.S. at the Senate at the federal level. So there's a lot of change and people who can run for a really long time. Notably, there was a rumor circulating that John F. Kennedy actually confronted Joe Biden before his death and said that he was a traitor to the U.S. I can't find anything that supports the timeline on that because Biden didn't show up till the 70s as far as people know, and Kennedy died in the early 60s, so there's like this huge gap there. I don't think anyone would imagine that it wouldn't come out. It seems more like obfuscation meant to discourage the rest of us from paying attention to the Kennedy files being opened up. I'm not sure I actually need them to be, but it's important to know that. That's probably just obfuscation. And, referring back to the previous episode of Pointing to Close, as we talked about how, I can turn music back on now, that you always said, we sort of jokingly said, you don't know why I was trafficked for so long in abuse and then blamed for the decisions that Endeavor WB made and so these other people made, because Buffalo Bill was working to undermine CA and also at Endeavor, and was Russian, and I was being blamed for the decisions. That's typical of abusers. They try to put you in charge of something you're not really in charge of and then blame you for the outcome when you're just the victim of the whole thing and you're not actually responsible for it. And that's true of any kind of abuser, whether they're a prolific one or really good at it or just a little one. They just don't take personal responsibility. And so when people talk about personal responsibility, they're not talking about like that you're supposed to be this magical god that conjures up solutions for everything in the world, for yourself or anyone else. It's that you don't actively blame everyone for what you're actually responsible for. That's really all it is. So, I have to note a couple couples that have not come out. Really quickly, when I was talking about radio signals and those issues, what I meant was that there's a fairly serious issue with radio signals like in Dubuque. We saw a lot around where the riverboats were, even go back to the 1920s, like even old radio signals being around that were used to stop crimes. And you look at the sort of progress of the U.S. going back to the 1920s and how many like accidents and tragedies sort of occurred because people really couldn't, do what they need to as far as understanding that technology, I guess, at the time. Like they just barely, mentioned on some of these boats and ships. And so all these weird accidents occurred because they didn't have that understanding of what radio signals really were and how to control them. And it's still an issue today in organized crime, except that the world is vastly different and vastly educated on the issue. And so what I do is investigate where those radio signals are at and apparent in different situations, and then try to bring it into the show if I can. I found some like a year ago here over at what's the old insane asylum where they used to dump women when the men were done with them, basically in Michigan. In the 1800s, 1900s, it's really scary, so early 1900s. There's definitely some over there that's just so creepy. I want to also announce there's several couples that need to be outed that are Russian FSB couples in Hollywood. They're supposedly older women with younger men, but that's Ashton, Kutcher, and Demi are still together. Chris Evans is with Thursday. She's the older woman that trafficked me for all these years. It's really nasty and Russian. And then you have, and this is a weird one. I never made sense out of it, but apparently Jamie Lee Curtis and Ben Affleck have been together for like forever. And I don't know if she's really FSB or she's just crazy, but they've been doing this weird thing with sort of them running around with, J-Lo and trying to set her up and driving everyone nuts. And then I received this bizarre amount of information recently stating, and this is going to pivot into what we're going to talk about next, which is that Salma Hayek, Alexander Rodriguez, and Ben Affleck want absolutely nothing to do with J-Lo, ever again. Mm-hmm. Because she's been kind of dragging them around and making them do events with her. Salma Hayek, it's just, she just wants to fight with her. And so this goes back to the 90s. I told you the story about how I had the actual government employees demanding that I certify that, J-Lo/Blanca could go back with Ben Affleck to be married again. And so then it's like this guy I'm not even responsible for, and somehow I'm the one who has to say, get him out. And this is what I mean about abusers not taking responsibility for their own behavior. Because she's clearly being abusive, the Russian FSB is clearly being abusive. So it's kind of important to recognize that. Because that's it just didn't make any sense at all that I would be asked about who J-Lo should be married to. I don't think she should be married to anyone. I think she belongs free. She belongs in prison. So, and that's also going to pivot around to, I'm going to get into Salma Hayek's story in a minute. Because it might actually be the least important. It's the one the U.S. government already figured out. I went through with them, FCA is back at least on that. But, and also she's one with a huge amount of money, so what does she even care about some of this stuff? But, they do. Even the big people need the little people support sometimes. So, here's the thing. There's been a huge amount of press recently about how Kanye West is having these interesting conversations with P. Diddy all of a sudden, like they're supposed to be friends. And his daughter is doing like raps with him, and it's supposed to be this big thing in the media. And what should Kim Kardashian do? Gosh, her ex-husband's so crazy with the kid. And I just look at it, I think, what are you doing? You're clearly trying to build a kid's career. It's all manufactured controversy. Kanye doesn't have a relationship with P. Diddy. He's the one person out of the sort of Rockefeller group around Jay-Z and the rest of them that very clearly doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the Russian MSB. And then he's got these weird, like, hate comments put out on his social media about, how he hates all these different people. And what I know about Kanye is that he's completely nuts. He's really all over the place and highly suggestible. But he's also, like, look at this. Can you see all that? That's like a list of people he's mad at. Or I don't know, maybe you go to We Are Hip Hop Freaks, they have a list. I'm not sure if this is totally true or if they just made it up. At the bottom it says, and of course the Jews after the black community. So I'm not sure that he's actually targeting Jewish people or the black community in that post. I think Kanye is a tricky one because he seemed to spend a lot of time trying to get the Russian FSB. And he's a lot like Nicole Kidman in that he's made money in the industry. And the rest of us really just need to like stand clear of whatever he's doing. Because he's frankly, he has a way of doing anarchy with them, and when he's done, after sort of mixing it up and blowing it all over, somehow there's another answer that comes out of all of it. And then to remember that Kim's a lawyer. So whatever it is they're doing, like whatever game they're playing, it's something legal. It's some kind of legal strategy. And I don't know this necessarily to help pity you. I'm pretty sure it's to keep their careers going, but they do have a bizarre way of kind of mixing things up and coming out with some strange answer at the end. And you're not going to figure out where they're really going with it until they're done. But if you were to jump in there and say, bad Kanye, or bad Kim, or what, and these people are rich. They have enough money to get married to each other and get divorced. Like, I, in this country, did not have the right to be on a Sigma system and get married to anyone that I would have liked to have been married to, and couldn't afford it. And now, I focus on work and employment all the time. So just try to remember they live in a different reality from everyone else. And a world that nobody else lives in might be the most important thing as far as I can tell. Because for me, the tragedy sometimes was that I realized that I really couldn't marry anyone that I would actually want to be married to legally in the U.S. And I've certainly dealt with a number of men that were traffickers who wanted to get married to me and then tried to be so stupid all they did was get agreements through dim cult groups that didn't mean anything because they were with the U.S. government. Did you have to actually get a license with the U.S. government? You're the justice of the peace, you're going to get married to somebody in the U.S. Gotta have a real thing. And then you gotta use your real name and you gotta back up with documents because my ex that people out of DC, it was David, also goes by the name Chris, like he's literally never really anything but the level boyfriend, ex-boyfriend, because he used false documents and used his real identity for his marriage license to me. So even though it was with the DC government, it didn't count for anything. It wasn't real, it's fraud. It was dissolved marriage of fraud, the hardest type of dissolution of a marriage agreement that you can get. But it was really easy because he lied about who he was. And he's also apparently Chris Evans, a really stupid actor who's involved with the cartels and terrorist groups and gangs. It's just Russian FSB to a believe. So I'm going to go talk about what happened to Salma Hayek, and I need to do a history lesson. We have to go back to Dubuque, Iowa in the 1980s. And we have to do the production of Fiddler on the Roof at Hempstead High School. And what it is that I auditioned for the show and was not cast in it as the little girl, even though I was fairly good for it. I was going to be cast as the youngest sister in Fiddler on the Roof. at Hempstead High School. And you say Hempstead High School is just a high school musical. No, everything in Dubuque, Iowa at the time in the 80s was prep for Endeavor, and CAA was all over the place. So people were trying to get their Hollywood megastar careers going, and films were constantly being made there. Major motion pictures were being made there. Wyatt Earp was partially filmed there. God bless for Gene Hackman who passed away. You know, it's craziness. A bunch of films by Sylvester Stallone filmed there. Other stuff's been filmed there since then. And so there was a woman named Julie, and I'm not going to go into her last name, but we have to talk about the curious and sad murder of Julie, because she was cast in it as the character of, let's look up Fiddler on the Roof for the actual play. And then I'm going to do the cast names. Let's see. I'm going to take a moment to look up the name of the character she was actually supposed to be playing. I don't know. I gotta look at this again. Fiddler on the Roof. She played the daughter that tries to marry the Gentile man and gets cast out. And it was about, it's supposed to be a Jewish Russian family in anti-Semitic Russia. So the main character of Tevye ends up casting out his daughter because she decides to fall in love with a Gentile man. And in Dubuque, the way it was portrayed was that she was someone that we were all supposed to feel terribly sorry for. I think that would have been Hodel. She was the second oldest daughter. I'm just going to look this up really quickly. We'll keep looking this up for a second. But I think you got where I'm going with this, that there was an over-sympathy in Dubuque at the time because of the Russian community there. Yeah, Kutcher and Hodel. You know what? I don't think I like Fiddler on the Roof. I think I hate that because it was incredibly sympathetic to the life of the Stalinists, and nope. I don't think I'd even want to be in the show. Yeah, one thing I came out of all this with is that so many of the movies that were created due to Endeavor and their relationships to American media were obviously just set up for the rest of us to be trafficked. So some of the stuff that like Nicole Kidman made when she was fighting with Cersei or these other people, and I didn't even realize that they were that far up there. Let's see this. I'm just gonna look at this dance for a minute to make sure. Well, anyways, the point is that Julie portrayed the position of the daughter who decides she's in love with a Gentile man and leaves the Jewish community in Russia at a time when there was a huge amount of anti-Semitism. And in Dubuque at the time, because of the Russian culture, there was an over-focus on that character and play point, to the point that Julie herself was actually abused and may have even been a Jewish person herself. She was beautiful and a true celebrity. I remember when I used to hang around with her and her boyfriend at the time that I thought they were true celebrities and thought they would make it really big in Hollywood, and they were supposed to. Patricia, who explained to you who she is, she's from the Russian FSB and also Iranian, extremely dangerous. Then you look at, Fatina, who's engaged in outright terrorist attacks in the U.S. and is now a pop singer today in the U.S. as well as internationally. Very clearly said to Patricia that they want to set Julie up to be killed. And I had a hard time figuring out where Julie even went because I was like flash forward to my late 20s, early 30s, was being questioned about her by investigators because she had disappeared back in Dubuque, and it was eventually determined that the last time anyone saw her alive was in the last performance of Fiddler on the Roof. Notably, the little girl who was casted at Hempstead High School then, this is in the late 80s, also disappeared. And when I asked about her to Patricia and Fatina, they said that she had just been acting out and disappeared. And I was supposed to like blow the whole thing off. Well, nobody can because she disappeared. The other problem is so did Julie. And the last time I saw Julie, she had blood coming out of her face and had been cut. And it's sort of how you know. Like, don't let logic defy. Don't let logic defy. Well, no. Let logic defy the reasons some of these jerks give for their behaviors, is what I'm trying to say. Let the logic rule. The woman had blood coming out her face. Fatina openly said that she wanted to kill her and blamed this Salma Hayek person who's going to be coming up in the industry. The fact that I met Salma Hayek later when I was in college at Luther, and I studied how to make documentary film through her, raw footage, like the old days when I took film and actually cut it and slice it together. I learned that from Salma Hayek because she's actually a documentary film aficionado, loves it. And unfortunately, she had been set up to take the blame for Julie's murder and death. And then had also, by the time I met her, had a bunch of fights with J-Lo, who turned out to be Blanca, but then Blanca cross-shock in the U.S., and over the movie Selena. Which, unfortunately, a member of the Russian FSB had killed Selena, literally with the idea of J-Lo then taking a position. So this cult thing of the cults and the weird cartels killing people and then wanting to make films about it in the 90s and 2000s is very real. The fact that everyone else is aware of that by now and tired of it is something you need to be savvy about, because we're sick of people being set up to be murdered so somebody can make a newsreel about it, who's like Russian FSB or Chinese CCP or Planet Fox or CNN or some other ridiculous network. And to know that John T. Casteen, who's now passed away, someone who was savvy to that in 2000s, is key. It is part of the excellence of his life and his legacy at the University of Virginia. And that's what I want you to understand, because Bettina very clearly said she wanted to blame Salma Hayek somehow, that because Salma Hayek was going to be set up to do that part in Selena. And then also that she got the role in From Dusk Till Dawn with Quentin Tarantino, where I was her body double in Traffic. I don't know that she necessarily had any control over it. I didn't interact with Salma Hayek on that film. What I know is that Julie and her face were used by Patricia because she broke into materials that Kendrick had at CAA. Part of the reason Kendrick was out at CAA is because he spent so much time setting up people who weren't Russian FSB. Salma Hayek is one of those. Salma Hayek is also a very powerful person who would have married to the man who now owns the parent company of CAA. So ha ha ha, or maybe not. But the point is that that's how crazy the two of them are, that they try to set up women who very clearly were beautiful and kind, even somewhat troubled, who had a path to marrying well, which Salma Hayek has had. Salma Hayek doesn't need the film industry. She's an actual artist. I know for a fact she never understood exactly people needing to live or making money because she's independently wealthy. She was always very much into the fact that I would continue forward and do my shows even if only like 2 or 3 people watch. But it's important to know that about her, because I met her and I didn't necessarily always like her or totally get along with her, but I know for a fact that she's not a screaming, raging lunatic like J-Lo, who actually took shits in public, masturbates, and is completely crazy, and supports the Russian FSB, and El Jalisco, and Trinidad. And unfortunately, the death of Julia, for those of you who haven't had a resolution for back in Iowa and Dubuque from all those years ago, because the 80s is a long time to wait till now, she was very clearly killed by Wilhelm and the guy that you know as Dan, that nicknamed Dan in the shows, in a cult murder. And unfortunately, some of her murder was tied to Ben Affleck. So you can see why Ben Affleck wants nothing to do with J-Lo, because J-Lo did that to him with her pursuit of Selena, and frankly used some of Julie's stock footage herself after Julie was dead, much like some of the other people that I detailed for you who've had their images taken and stolen after they were murdered and used by Endeavor. So that's what you need to know about all of that. And a lot of the investigations revolved around these bizarre, overly complex setups with, Patricia and Fatina and their relationship of hacking everything and wanting to blame other women with money or prestige of any kind. And, there wasn't just the being of the abuse of my mom and her death, because she was a regular person who went through that, didn't have enough money and pull to really do as much as she could have about it. She simply died eventually. She was finally murdered. She found stab wounds in her body. They tried to cover up and said all things with cancer. It wasn't. And to understand that this complex network I'm detailing with Endeavor, WME, has to be understood because it's a massive cartel and founded by a man who's part of the Russian FSB. And when Kanye says he hates the Jews, I think he's actually talking about Endeavor, because the company was founded by a bunch of people who pretend to be Jewish and are not, and are clearly rejected by the actual Jewish communities in the U.S. The only place I ever found any acceptance of them was in some of these cult churches founded by the Russian FSB, like the U.S.A, for example. Like there's a big one on Nebraska Avenue in Washington, D.C. So you have to consider that, the cartels have operated under the auspices of being religious organizations and nonprofits, mosques, temples, churches, and there's a lot of us who simply gotten out of it all by simply no longer actively participating in any religious group. It's unfortunate because Julie was a beautiful singer and beautiful woman. And if you think it wasn't important, Patricia was still lying about her death even as late as 2010, 2011 to me. Like, she would get on a phone conversation with me, with the U.S. government was tracking, where she would claim that Julie had become raped and was becoming a man. And in fact, it turned out that Julie had actually been murdered all those years ago in the 80s. So she spent all those decades trying to cover up her death, even though she very clearly said she wanted to kill her, along with Patricia in the 80s. And she very clearly did murder her. She lied to all of us and said that she just took off already to go out to California for Endeavor. And she lied about it so, like, weird, like, point blank. She's like, oh, she's just gone already to California. She's just going after with Endeavor. She's with Kendrick. And she's not. And she's dead. And the last time anyone saw her even partially alive, she had blood all over her face. She was pretty clearly murdered in a cold killing related to the cartels in the late 80s. And John was the guy who actually got that. That's how I'm going to tie this show together, because it's one of the harder shows to make, and I want to make beautiful, bright shows, but the brightness of this is that I managed to make this entire show without a pulse attack coming through, because we'd worked so long and hard on the technology, and then I can make this for you here on YouTube, and we're going to distribute it, and I need to work on getting more funding for my shows here, so we can keep going to these topics. I'm working on some better sets, but but that's just how it's got to go. That's what these shows are about. And to know that, Irish and as many people like to watch Simply Stay, but they're probably the most important shows that I'll make. Simply Yoga will be returning when the warm weather returns. I'll get back to doing those. And, I've got some other exciting news coming up and exciting shows. And, I think going forward, I'm welcome to supporters, and I love feedback. If anyone has ideas for funding models for the show, I'd be happy to hear those. I get a lot of people that want me to hire them, and I don't have money right now to hire more people to create a, sort of profit pipeline on the show. And so I'm still working on that, at least at this point. And it's important to note that, some of the shows are literally being made because, I explained to you all in previous shows, like how Salma actually going to Luther College and running interference on what probably would have been Patrick and somebody, or taking his name out. Kendrick and some of these other dumb guys, think they could just kill somebody. Because how stupid they were. And all these students labor trafficked. And she didn't handle it very well either, but I ended up going through and talking with CAO about that, and so they've certainly come up with better strategies, and so the rest of us. And we're all just like refining our processes, because you're dealing with a really nasty network from the Russian FSB of multiple terrorist groups throughout the U.S. Unfortunately, you have an entire company that's pushed by Susanne and Hamilton, and they would even keep like subscribers and viewers out of my show to try to keep you from getting information, because they've got control of so much of the media. It got vished and hacked and messed up, vished and fished, right? So, anyways, I will continue to be watching and making shows, and you can look forward to more Simply Yoga with Deborah in the future. Simply Cooking with Deborah is on OnlyFans at Deborah K. I'm still on Playboy, but they're still having problems with accounts. I noticed Playboy stock has dropped to $1 per share, which is really crazy. So I'll just be hanging out with them until they get all that fixed, and then we'll be actively working again on Playboy whenever they have it fixed. And that's it. So happy Thursday, happy first day of spring. This is a beautiful day wherever you're at. You're going to be live. The sky is blue outside here. We have snow on the ground. Can't beat it. So happy spring, people. I'm going to go ahead and turn this off now. And thank you for bearing with me through the sort of memorial for John T. Casteen, and also the life of Julie from Dubuque, who tragically died all those years ago. I'm going to cut this off, and that'll be it.